Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and metamodernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
All right, welcome back to the next iteration of the dialogue. Unfortunately, this part of the dialogue, Raphael was unable to be a part of due to personal reasons, but he will definitely try to be with us on the next part. So it'll just be me and our guest today, Dr. Tracy C. West. And it's huge because today we're talking about the intersectionality of metamodernism and gender violence. Now, Dr. West comes with a significant background in her work with gender violence. And so this is why her voice and her experiences and her work are valid in terms of talking about different ways of looking at gender as well as feminism, right? And these ideas of identity, especially during these times. And so we will give it over to Dr. West. Please start with, maybe a little bit about your work and your passions into this, and how is it so relative?
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you and to have a chance to talk with you and think together, because that's what is most important, is that we in some ways engage one another, listen to one another, learn from one another, and hopefully transform our world, which is always a joint project. So I spend my time mainly teaching, writing, research, activism. I teach Christian social ethics and African American studies. I am especially interested in the ways in which our communal public lives can be places where harm and violence and violation and harassment are given permission, rooted on our cultural relationships in church life, in our work lives, in our intimate connections with each other, in our families, and with our intimate partners, and how that gets given permission publicly, and also how there is a resource for ending violence, preventing that kind of harm that we can draw from in our, again, the ways in which we interact with one another based on our sort of intimate, political, social, spiritual commitments. So I'm very interested in gender violence and harm, but I'm especially wanting us to see all of the ways in which we perpetuate the problem systemically and one-on-one in our individual relationships with one another, so that there isn't a split between something that happens publicly has nothing to do with something that happens privately. Those are always connected to one another. And so that's one of the reasons why gender violence is such an important subject in my view, because it has this holistic quality that it's always pulling our attention to our public lives, our institutional messages about the valuing or devaluing of who we are related to gender and race and sexuality and class. But at the same time, there is a resource that's possible when we make those connections between the public and also our private, intimate selves and lives. A resource that can transform, hopefully, the ways in which we give that permission for so much harm and violation, and ways to demean and to not deny equal dignity and human worth. So that's one of the things why it's my passion, because those are connected, the intimate and the private and the public, the systemic right? The systemic, institutional life, political, and social kind of messages about what is gender are directly connected to the very, very most vulnerable parts of who we are and our neediness spiritually and emotionally, and the ways in which we identify who we are, how we self-identify our genderedness, or in my case, I would say blackness, our race, but I would say in my case, blackness is all of those things come from my own sort of experiential journey. So that's just one example of that connection that both draws attention to this tidal wave of harm, but it also draws attention to resources that are there too. So don't get me started on how it's relevant, because I got a lot to say about that, and I'll try to keep it short. This is a political moment, and we're taping this in 2025, and so this is a political moment where it's the beginning of Donald Trump's second term in office as president. And in a matter of just a couple of months, just a few months, our government has shifted to a deeply fascist, totalitarian state related to media, related to education, related to the rule of law, just sort of every level you can think of if you were thinking about fascism. And in addition to that, has sent forth a tidal wave of destruction, human cost, from refugee camps all over the world, where people are no longer receiving just a little bit of rice or medical care, right? So just intense human destruction in addition to political destruction in Ukraine, in Gaza, right? I'm not so interested in Trump as an individual as how is there so much mass support, which there is, particularly among Christians, for this like tidal wave of fascism and the targeting of some of the most vulnerable, like particularly transgender children, I'm going to use the term siblings, members of our communities, in particular around the world, those who are starved, literally on the brink of starvation, to deny them food, right? And Christians, particularly among Christians, there's mass support, there's glee, right? Tremendous popularity. How does that happen? And one of the ways in which a gender violence analysis can possibly assist, right? So I don't want to overstate, like, I've got the answer. That's not my claim. Really, I want to invite you to just think with me a little bit, because I want to explore how a gender violence analysis and lens of analysis might be helpful. Is one of the things that abusers do so successfully is they help to create a sense of uncertainty. Often when people think about abusers, domestic violence abuse, but it can be sexual abuse of a child, or sexual abuse of a partner, or sexual in an intimate relationship, or sexual abuse that goes on in a prison, or sexual abuse that goes on in an ICE detention center, right? So in all sorts of places. But one of the things that people often think that it's about the physical assault where the power and control is exercised, that the ways in which people are violated, that is what people identify as the main tool of power and control, right? That physical invasion, right? I want to say one of the main ways in which abusers function is to create chaos and uncertainty. And one moment I'm humiliating you, right? I'm saying, I'm going to just make you wish you just didn't wake up this morning. And I'm doing it in a very personal way, right? I'm going for how you look, God, what your capabilities are. You're stupid, right? Right. So I'm going. And then another moment I'm going to say, you know what? I can work with you. I like you. I love you. You're cool with me. But you just have such an ugly, right? And so then you're thrown off, right? And one of the things that you do, right, is you're riveted to what am I going to do, right? I think you're caught. What am I going Are you going to be assaulted verbally, emotionally, spiritually? Are you going to have some space where you can breathe because you're going to get some accolade and a sense of reinforcement right? You don't know. So you got to stay, giving me all of your attention. All of your sense of who you are gets completely subordinated to the ways in which you got to watch what I'm doing. Right? And I have control over you. I have control and power. And trying to understand that dynamic, in my view, helps us to understand, like, why is Congress like there are no Democrats, there are no Republicans, like, right? Because they're just in this kind of syndrome. And then globally as well, Europeans, what's he going to do, right? He's going to take away aid altogether. He's going to completely do ethnic cleansing of Gaza. He's got, right? Like, we don't know. And so it helps us to understand what is the reclaiming possibly, right? So I don't know. Does this make sense? You know what I'm trying to say? Possibly. What is the reclaiming we need to do?
Yeah, definitely. We hear you. Just to plug in your book that also inspired this dialogue, Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality.
Yes.
We brought this up in our last episode with me and Raphael, and we just wanted to bring this up right quick because it's so relevant to what you're talking about. So, here on page 53 in chapter 1, you start talking about how television shows became a form of violence against women. And it's interesting that the information you brought up, because you brought up shows like Jerry Springer and how these psychologically push the viewers to feel entertained by the trauma and violence towards, gender in that sense, towards women, especially women of color,
Especially women,
African American women, Black women,
especially women of color. Especially women of color, yes.
especially women of color, yes, because as
and
we
poor.
go
And
ahead,
can I say poor, economically poor folks.
good point.
Yes. Yes.
And as you get more into the chapter, you really start to unravel how television is a powerful moral mechanism. This is a paraphrase, but you really go into it saying violence has become such a staple source of entertainment in this medium of television. And it's so interesting. It made me think of even my own experience with television as a child and growing up and watching other people so glued to the television. They were glued to watching things that revolved around violence to an extent. It entertained them, right?
Yes.
Then as we got older, we start to see connections like the concept and idea of the Colosseum in Rome and how, you give the people bread and violence and somehow you manage that very well. You keep them entertained. So we
Yes.
bring this up because there seems like there's a deep connection between these things in terms of motive and agenda. Anything come to mind when you hear about these things?
Yes. It was so important to me to try, because if you say, okay, there's a cultural tolerance for gender violence, that statement just doesn't convey enough. It's like, of course there's a cultural tolerance. Well, what do you mean? And so to try and give an example of media, the role, and one example of particularly in late 20th century and early, I think media now, television doesn't represent, isn't the example I would use now, but if I'm trying to describe how we got to where we are now, then I want to say late 20th century, early 21st century, just, I don't know, Law and Order, SUV. So just all of these, like, fictional as well as non-fictional numbing of our sensibilities around gender violence have been so crucial to the ways in which we have leaders who have been perpetrators of violence, that we know that they've been perpetrators of violence, but that somehow does not impact the kind of authority that they have over our political lives. How does that happen? How does that numbness happen? There are a lot of factors, there are a lot of ways, but I was just trying to give an example that media helps to create that. And so many of our leaders and our most successful leaders now, particularly cisgender men, who have part of how they exercise power is through bullying, and part of their bullying is very gendered. Part of their understanding of what it means to be a cis male, like hetero male, is to assert the right to demean someone and to keep doing it until they submit, to keep bullying them, whether it's a leader or whether it's a woman they work with every day in their sort of political sphere. I'm thinking of the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and the stories about the kind of inappropriate misconduct that in relationship to the women that he worked with on an everyday basis, that the women were brave enough to testify and that the attorney general took seriously. Fortunately, there are lots of examples. Because I'm in the New York area, that's an example that comes to mind immediately. And also this example of how does the tolerance occur. But I want to say there's something about gender violence that and gender, the gendered aspect of bullying that targets vulnerable members of our community. And right now, in particular, people who identify as non-binary and people who identify as transgender, particularly vulnerable are trans women of color, brown and black trans women. Now, not exclusively, right? So I don't want to say that white trans women are not targeted, because that would not be true. But for some of the most heinous murders and rape and beatings, the stats tend to be much higher for brown and black trans women. And so I just want to say that it helps us again to think about a gender violence lens, because part of the goal of bullying trans folks is to say you may not choose how you understand your gendered identity. That is not a choice you are allowed. It is the ultimate exercise in saying this is the one definition of gender. If you are going to be a woman, you're going to act like this. You're going to look like this. You're going to be desirable in this way. You know, it's a reinforcing of the most extreme kind of controlling behavior. I'm wanting to say that again, a gender violence analysis helps us to see that freedom, fluidity, a kind of holistic, integrated sense of one's agency and ability to be affirmed in your spiritual, physical, sexual, gendered, racialized self, that is an act of defiance of gender control. So I want us to link the heterosexual domestic violence, intimate behavior is directly related to the bullying and the targeting of trans members of our communities, because it's about controlling and having a sense that there's only one definition of what it means to be woman, to be man. And somebody else gets to control and tell you what that is. And if you don't fit, there will be consequences for you. If you don't submit to that control. In both instances, like, right, a heterosexual husband says, you don't have my dinner on, when I'm ready for it, when I get home. Or you're just an ugly, right? You look ugly. That's not what and I come home, I don't want to look at that, right? Who humiliates you based on, right, this kind of gendered controlling way of doing harm is linked to the targeting of trans folks and members of our communities and non-binary folks who say, I don't fit and I don't want to fit into that narrow definition. And broader society, in this case, highest political, right? The highest political arms of power are literally saying the consequences will be quite dire for you and your freedoms here in the U.S. So also wanting us to see the relevance of this moment and the sense of control that has its same roots often in Christian understandings, often in Christian, because we're Christian dominated. U.S. is a Christian dominated society. Christian interpretations of scripture, and so often interpret Christianity as a place not of freedom, not of affirmation of our bodies, our embodied self, and our spirituality linked to our embodied self, but just the opposite, a place of restrictive, condemning, narrow consequences for those who claim a sense of freedom, and also a sense of being reflected in who God is. To say no, not God created me. That's who God is. We reflect who God is in such abundance, like an abundance of diversity, and gender and including gender very much as this diverse understanding that in many ways we have yet to be able to, like, there are possibilities we haven't even thought of that I think are reflected in the divine. And we learn from our diverse siblings all the ways there are to reflect that divine power and presence and beauty.
Yeah, exactly. That's so spot on. We agree. What you said brought up something that me and Raphael were talking about in the most recent previous podcast episode, which we labeled meta-feminism. And we were just scraping the surface. We put together a pretty good bibliography, but again, just scraping the surface. But dialogue, we were talking also about a little bit about reinterpretation of sacred texts like Genesis. And you brought up how the interpretation seems to be at the center of a lot of these things, right? So,
yes, center of so much harm, so much
right.
harm. Yeah,
We agree. And how also these interpretations hold together the control, right? We were talking about that. And just briefly, we were talking about in the Genesis story with Adam and Eve, there is another perspective that includes and suggests that Eve was the second iteration, and that there was a first iteration of woman, and that was named Lilith symbolically. And we were talking a little bit about that because it was interesting how your perspective of the Bible then moving forward changes if you then go with the understanding that Eve actually was the reinvention by man, like saying this is our imagination and interpretation of the perfect woman,
yes,
Eve. But the first one, Lilith, being so wild and untamable, uncontrollable,
yes,
free spirited,
yes,
she could not be good in whatever structure man was creating that boasted man, such as a patriarchal system.
yeah.
So this kind of mythology, if you would, and symbolic talking, what comes of it when you think of gender violence in your work? What would you add or take away from this?
Yes, I just want to say biblical studies is not my area, but I am a beneficiary of feminist biblical hermeneutics. And one of the things that I love about scripture and about ancient myths that are part of a range of religious traditions. I am a Christian. I was brought up and raised as a Christian, and I am a Christian clergy person. However, I am a student of religion, so it's important to me to learn a range of religious traditions other than my own and find ways that I see connections and also disconnections, right? Because then my imagination of what is sacred gets expanded, and that's a good thing to me. So that's sort of my backdrop of like religious understandings, including the Lilith ancient tradition. And so because ultimately our sacred scriptures, in my view, are a resource enabling us to see how the divine and also spiritual life is lived out in the stories of communities. They're stories. They're all stories about communities and community life. And I don't care what tradition it is, there is in some way trying to get us to see, okay, how is this a notion of what is spirit or divine spirit or the divine, how does it exist in the ways in which people are relating to each other in their family life, in their tribal life, in their national life, in their relationship to the earth, to the air, especially agrarian life, so often to act just food, like growing food, having enough food, making sure people do have enough food. And when, you got to let the land lay fallow, right? So all of these stories have to do with these range of community stories about community life and relationship, as well as war among certain kinds of groups. And so how does that, is that presence manifested in ways that enable flourishing? And how is that presence manifested in ways that create repression, harm, hatred between groups, conquering of groups, right? And in particular, given my interest in gender violence, what are the gendered messages? And most of our religious traditions are deeply heteropatriarchal. And so how do we receive those traditions in ways that we are able to, we have some tools to critique them and critique those limitations, because the storytellers were human storytellers and reflecting their cultural biases. In all cases, we all reflect our cultural biases as we tell these stories. But the spirituality I think of that occurs and matters most, because I'm so interested in like the personal and the political, the private and the public. So I'm interested in the text and the context. And so where does the spirit, the divine, an understanding of who we are and who God is, because my tradition has a deity. How does that happen in the dialogue as I encounter the text, as I ask questions about it, as I meditate, listen, right? A little silence. I know in U.S. culture, we're not too big on silence. Not too big on that. Gotta talk. Fill up the silences. Anyway, so I'm always wanting us to see in the tradition is deeply heteropatriarchal. That's indisputable in my view. But we engage it, and how do we engage it? And in that engagement, which hopefully is communal, hopefully to some extent it has a communal component. It's not just I have to learn from, I spend a lot of time around people who are writing and researching. So I need to read some of those folks, right? So when I say communal, I'm not the first person to think about how to critique this text. And that's one of the benefits, in my view, of feminist biblical hermeneutics, feminist theology, feminist ethics, womanist, mujerista work that centers some notion of gender in the kinds of critiques that they create within particularly Christian religious tradition, but other religious traditions, Muslim and Jewish religious traditions in particular, because those are our siblings in the Abrahamic and in that kind of tradition. So yes, I love those ancient stories and what it means to think about them and how they expand our ability to think of, to correct some of the gendered notions that are extremely harmful, because they're about narrow understandings of who one can be. And notice I'm saying gendered, like who one can be in all of the ways in which we understand gender. So one of the things that has happened is in my own work, I really, my earliest work I wrote a book called Wounds of the Spirit, where I really focused on violence against Black women. And it was very important, Black US women. It was very important to me to tell the stories and listen to, because I did a series of interviews with US Black women and research of how issues of racism, sexuality, gender, and faith were integrated, thoroughly intersectional in the obstacles that Black women who had experienced gender violence, particularly sexual violence and domestic violence, experienced, and were also resources. But the obstacles, especially related to issues of shame and erasure. I was sort of like zeroing in on two main pieces. One, like racism, anti-Black racism is so much about shaming. It's so much about shaming. And Christian traditions around gender violence, particularly sexual violence, but gender violence, but domestic violence is so much about shame. What did you do wrong? What did you do to make this happen, right? Blaming, shaming, blaming, and issues of class as well. I am very, very, very interested in understanding the ways in which very, very economically poor Black women, especially those who are dependent on public assistance, are shamed for needing public assistance, right? And so how that creates a sense, it is your fault to the person who's been victimized by violence. And especially in Black communities, Black women should protect Black men, not say anything, because the police and the criminal justice system, the way they will treat Black men, right? So, and you're shaming, you're putting your dirty laundry out there anyway. So just trying to help us to think through how these came together, political and cultural and social and religious, particularly Christian understandings, all work together with each other, all of those different forms of shaming with each other to re-victimize and silence Black women. So that was a really important piece of work for me. But I want to say my work, it's become more and more important to me to talk not just about violence experienced by Black women. That's been a very important piece, but also of my Black feminist Christian social ethics and work in African American studies, but also to get clearer about, really, I'm talking about gender. I'm talking about gendered violation, and to see the targeting, like hate violence, anti-trans hate violence, that's gendered violence, and to see those links. And in my book, Solidarity, Defiant Spirituality, which you mentioned, to see how Black activists are connected across the globe in doing a wide range of strategies and activist work that people here, that we can learn from here in the US related to gender violence. So that's just an example of why it's important to me to keep reading and listening and being in community and growing and expanding our understandings of this epidemic. In one sense, you could say epidemic, but in another sense, a kind of just everyday form, demeaning and humiliating and bullying in gendered ways in churches and local churches. It's just tolerated. That's just how it is. And that message gets communicated by leaders and also family members. That sense of betrayal that occurs, your own family member can tell you.
In this thought-provoking episode of Between Shelves, we dive into the transformative concept of gender violence and identity. In this dialogue with Dr. Traci C. West, we unpack how meta-modernism manifests within the context of gender and gender violence, exploring themes of fluidity, identity, and the complexities of navigating a world that often seeks to confine and control. From art to philosophy, culture, and spirituality, we're unpacking how Black transhumanism disrupts outdated frameworks around race, belonging, and self-expression, opening up new pathways for reimagining the future. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's return to our dialogue with Dr. Traci C. West as we continue exploring how gender violence reshapes our understanding of gender, identity, creativity, and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
Yeah, what you were saying is so spot on, right? Like when we start talking about metamodernism and the framework of thinking, where we've been talking about this over a series of episodes. What can metamodernism framework look like in different contexts? So when we talk about gender violence, it's very interesting and complicated, as you already expressed, that we really can't talk about everything in, a short, podcast dialogue, but just barely skimming the surface, we see that there's so many intricate ways in which gender violence is active in all of our lives, whether it's directly or indirectly. You mentioned a few scenarios where it could be a heterosexual male witnessing or observing it to their counterpart who may be a female, heterosexual female. And then you can have in a different instance a situation where they're not heterosexual, they're non-binary, or even a queer couple, like then all of a sudden gender violence starts to look a little different, right? And a lot of people are accustomed to seeing it maybe one particular way. And maybe that could be part of that whole kind of, I feel like it was more of like a symbolic analogy you brought up with the television, right? Some people will suggest like MK Ultra or something, like through television or media they have been utilizing this technology to manipulate how we think, how we respond to things, and even how we treat each other, right? In lamest terms. And so when we sit here and say, well, how do I treat my daughter, my sister, my mother, my grandmother, my wife, my friends, my elders, it's like it seems through history extensively, at least over a millennia, there's been this idea that women should be subordinate or the feminine. The energy of femininity should be second tier, it should listen, it should take orders, right? And we were mentioning this when we were saying how what happens if we reimagine Genesis and we start to see that Eve didn't mess up. But we're not experiencing what we're experiencing because Eve decided to do something God strictly said not to do. Like you said, when we sit here with spirit in present moment and try to reinterpret these things or read and understand these things, questions do rise. Why would God set this to be the only rule? If God created everything and said, this is a garden I created for you, everything is yours except this tree I also created. It kind of seems like a traumatized, God, and again, these are like human qualities we're reflecting off of God, right? In these stories and saying,
Yes.
God
Yes.
has no trust, right? So God sets us up and says, I put this tree of knowledge here. Don't eat from it. Let's see how long you go with, listening, how well you're obedient, it seems, right? That was the test, or a measure.
Exactly.
And it just seems like throughout history, on the feminine, gender characteristics, psychology, the archetype of the feminine, it seems like this has been targeted and attacked, right? To say that particular thing needs to always obey.
Right.
Like we can never be in a position of authority or power or wisdom or contribute, anything because no, men got it with the masculine
Yes.
has it. You know what I mean?
The patriarchal storyteller, that the dominant voice in the community is often the only one that's seen as authoritative. But that doesn't mean that's the only voice, though. It's never the only voice. It's never the only perspective. And so how do we find the tools to listen to the community that's not the dominant in whether it's the ancient community or even our contemporary community that clearly has a much broader sense of freedom related to how we are gendered.
Yeah, definitely. And, we just wanted to be respectful of time,
Yes.
Thank you so much for making the time to even have this dialogue and share your wisdom and your work. Our listeners would greatly appreciate this because, not enough people are talking about these things. And we're just trying to, start it up,
Good.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about it and also to make links to our contemporary what's in the headlines. So good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, on this note, this concludes our podcast. Thank you again for joining the dialogue, and we hope to have an iteration again in the near future.
Yes.
And again, every podcast will have a bibliography. So again, we'll have your books there too for people with the links to make it a little easier to find your work, because it's hard these days,
Yes, absolutely.
But did you have any closing remarks you wanted to say to the listeners before we go at all? Or you good?
No, I'm good. I just want to say, claim your space of affirmation and liberation for yourself, but for your community. So gendered freedom, liberation, and affirmation. Yes. And equality.
Powerful.
Yes.
Thank
Good.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. West.
Take care.